Hi everyone, I'm Dave Leonardo and welcome to Changing Minds. I'm going to be your host for today and I'm delighted to have our special guest, Magda Osman. She's a reader in experimental psychology from Queen Mary University, London, but more importantly, she's a great colleague and a really good friend as well. So delighted to have you here, Magda. Way back when, it's quite a while back, when me and Magda were working at UCL on decision making, people didn't really know what behavioural decision-making was or what learning theory was or anything like that. Whereas nowadays, everyone seems to know about nudge, behavioural change. You know, you can't avoid people pop up on Newsnight discussing it. So, I mean, and now Magda has actually become an expert in the field. So I'm really interested to know, how did she end up in such a popular field?
Thanks, Dave. Well, the main areas of my interest, along with decision making, are control and agency. So, you know, where do we think we have some degree of control over things that happen in our lives, and in an associated way, the degree to which we think we have agency over that. So, you know, we are the authors of the change that happened, that we experience. So given that and the connection to decision making, then it seemed like a kind of natural extension to look at ways in which there have been efforts to try to improve the way people behave for their own good as well as for social good. And that, of course, invites a whole load of other things, not just decision making, the processes of decision making and how we can target those, but also the degree to which we still feel we have control and free choice in contexts where those kinds of interventions you referred to occur. And they occur in all manner of contexts. So anything to do with organ donation, to pro-environmental behaviors, to health, to personal finances. So those kinds of interventions just appear absolutely everywhere, which is probably why now the public are so aware of all of these things.
Great, thanks. So nudge theory was built on a rather pessimistic view of humans, kind of bumbling around with loads of biases, you know, like two citizens, one which is just flawed and does stupid things, the other one which is can't be bothered to help that much. And so I'm just wondering whether, I mean, my sense is that people are smarter than that. And so is that a problem, that the conception of the mind as a kind of biased, you know, bumbling around as a biased thing, does that kind of change the way we might approach behavioral interventions and even potentially change the success of our interventions?
Yeah, well, yes. I mean, there's a lot to unpack there, because there's a load of loaded assumptions that are made. And yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I think that there is a reason to kind of worry about what the implications are and what kind of message that kind of sends to the public about their capacity, or at least what they would assume choice architects, you know, the people that actually introduce the interventions, assume of their capacity, which is quite limited, in fact. To come at this from the angle that I kind of care about most is this kind of distinction between, you know, what goes on in system one, kind of unconscious processes, and system two, the kind of conscious realm that we deal with. And there's a lot that's made, especially in the context of, well, let's be generous here, nudge theory, although it's not necessarily a theory as my understanding of theories go, which is that if you actually, you circumvent what happens at a conscious level, because what people say they're going to do and what they do are misaligned. So actually the better way to go, especially if you want to kind of generate effective behavioral change, is to kind of circumvent what goes on consciously and target unconscious processes, under the assumption that we're kind of filled with biases and, as you say, kind of bumbling around. Those are quite loaded kinds of assumptions, and the field, as I understand it, from the things I'm most interested in, don't seem to reliably show that there's a dissociation between what goes on unconsciously and consciously. And there's also problems in demonstrating the role of the unconscious in influencing observable behavior. So if you take that, as a position, then that there are somewhat, problems in kind of thinking, well, okay, what we need to do is kind of target the unconscious, because everybody's kind of filled with all of these biases they're not even aware of. This is the problem. It's a bit but yeah, exactly. So what we'll do is, because we're the kind of, we're the ones that have, an ability to know what's going on in your mind without you knowing, and manipulate that in some way. It's kind of worrying, but it's also, at least from an evidence point of view, there doesn't seem to be much evidence that actually any of those kind of efforts to target the unconscious necessarily work, at least in the kind of context of behavioral change. However, the literature, and at least those who were involved in kind of the behavioral change, nudgy kind of stuff, would kind of lead you to believe is that those kinds of interventions tend to work much better. So the idea is that if you know what the nudge is trying to do, then you'll react against it. So it's better if it targets you on an unconscious level where you're not aware of it. But so one other kind of important caveat here, which is, so not just my own kind of work, but others kind of show the same kind of thing, which is that if you look at what public perceptions are around in behavioral and change interventions, what it tends to show is that people judge the efficacy of transparent interventions, so those that are targeting you at a conscious level. So they judge those as most effective, they're judged as most acceptable, least unethical. So for on all those kind of measures, they're going to be much more persuasive. And also, so the assumption is they're going to work that much better if you know what they are, what they're designed to do in terms of changing your behavior, and you know that they're present. So all of those things seem to push in the direction that actually you're better off just working on the assumption that you target the things that people kind of know about themselves and that they actually want to change, and that you do it on a conscious level. So all of this sort of kind of points in the direction against kind of, manipulating things at an unconscious level that, no one knows about, aside from the fact that actually that doesn't work.
I'm pleased to hear. So I'm really interested in your work. You talk about how behavioural interventions fail and what we could learn from that. So I'm wondering if you could give us an example.
Yes, and this is one of my favorite examples because it kind of, it illustrates kind of epic fail, but with good intentions. So the idea was this was a series of interventions that were introduced on a university campus with the idea ultimately of trying to reduce kind of calorific consumption. So that is, getting those on campus to not drink kind of high sugary content drinks. So what they did was they changed the ratio of healthy to unhealthy items in drinks dispensers. So the ratio was originally something like sort of 10% kind of healthy, and they increased that to 30%. And then the other thing that they wanted to do is say, we won't actually include water in the drinks dispensers as the healthy kind of drink. We'll just make it kind of fruit juices and flavored or sugared water. With the idea that actually what you do is you buy the drink, you finish it, and then you'd have the bottle, you keep the bottle. And then what they did was they retrofitted all of these drinks fountains on campus to help people to refill their bottles with actual water. You think, well, that's great. And also the idea was that you would reduce littering. So there's a kind of a number of things. You think, okay, this is definitely going to work. This is great. Yeah, look at all of these things that we get kind of for free. And also there was kind of lots of efforts to campaign around campus to encourage people to drink water and so on. But actually, over the course of those interventions, once they were looking at the effects of those interventions after like about 18 months, which it took quite some time to actually introduce, the consumption of sugary drinks went up rather than reduce. Littering went up, and no one bothered using the water from filling their bottles with the water from the drinks fountain. So it was, a staggering, epic fail, I would say. One thing that's kind of useful in terms of, thinking about why those failures occurred. One thing that was kind of interest to me was, why, for instance, did people not fill up the bottles with the water on campus? So it turns out that in the local area, there was a long problem with, it's been a problem for a long period of time, that the water purity and quality was kind of suspiciously low. So this was well known in the area. So while, let's say, objectively that was dealt with, public perception was still somewhat skeptical of the water quality and purity. Well, again, it might have been a good idea to have a kind of think about that before you try to encourage people to drink the water that they kind of think is somewhat suspiciously not pure. So that gives you an idea of actually the broader context in which you introduce interventions really matters, right? So if you're only focused, on the behavioral outcome itself, and you're only scrutinizing that and the effectiveness of the intervention, you're kind of missing out a whole load of other kind of contextual factors, which actually in this case and many other cases that we looked at with these failures really matters, right? So they are the derailers of the interventions, which gives you an idea that you actually might want to do your homework a bit better.
Yeah, that's a great example. Yeah, so it brings us to a broader question in a way, like it's called behavioral science. Is it a science? I mean, do they really care about theory and evidence, or is it really just focusing on what works and then occasionally it doesn't work? So just wondering whether what's your take on that kind of?
Well, it's tricky, right? Because let's say different organizations that are interested in introducing behavioral change interventions have different incentives and different motivations. And so let's say if you can afford to trial 20 different types of interventions all at once, you might not have a particular theory around that. You just say, okay, here's a whole load of things that we can trial because we can afford to trial them. And we show that this one thing out of all of these others works. Well, okay, what's the scientific credibility of that? But you think, well, does it matter that there is a limited kind of scientific credibility when the motivation is to find something that works? So let's say where it matters is that if you're in the business of trying to introduce changes that lead to positive behavioral outcomes, if you trial something, okay, well, I want to know why it worked, how reliable it is as well, so that if I want to repeat that, I achieve the same outcome. But if you have no idea, you don't have a theory to start with, or you have very vague or imprecise hypotheses to explain the connection, the causal mechanisms. I mean, this is kind of your territory. Then yeah, right. But then there's a problem, right? Because you want to be able to do things in a repeated manner. So from that point of view, you should adopt a kind of scientific approach, and it's not like it's unnecessarily burdensome or laborsome to actually do that. And actually, in the long run, it will save you a lot of effort and time, because if you don't do that, it is just trial and error. And say, well, from that point of view, no, I wouldn't say that it is a scientific approach. the other thing is that there kind of seems to be a somewhat departure or a dissociation, let's say, because the literature might be robust in one sense in terms of theorizing and specifying, you know, and actually quite prescriptive about what you should do when you're going about kind of introducing behavioral interventions. But there's so the idealized sense is kind of at least articulated in published literature and frameworks and theories and that kind of thing. But the reality is somewhat departing from that. So you go, well, what's the disconnect here? Why is the disconnect? And I would say that actually the disconnect might be explained by the different motivations that different groups have in trialing interventions. So let's say, yeah, there might be a particular academic group that is interested in doing things scientifically, but it might not necessarily be the case in other places. I'm trying to be diplomatic here, because you understand as a practitioner that you're trying to create some effective change, but may not always be doing the things in the way that we would consider as kind of the idealized approach.
That's good. No, that's great. Yeah, I don't want you to lose all your jobs. So
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Don't want, you know, this could be the interview that sinks everything. Okay, so just switching a little bit to I'm interested in questions of responsibility and how we not just, you know, like how we judge people responsible, but how we take on a responsible approach to science or behavioral change or that kind of thing. So I'm wondering how that plays out in a domain where you might have these kind of slightly speculative interventions, which could actually change people's lives in some way. And so it feels like responsibility is quite an important concept, both to try and be responsible, but also what do you do when things go wrong and how do you allocate responsibility? And so I'm wondering whether there's been much work on that in that domain.
Well, not as far as I know, or at least not in the way that I know you approach things with respect to kind of responsibility, especially the kind of causal basis or causal reasoning basis behind that. So I'm curious, actually. So I'll turn the question back to you at some point, because I'm curious what you have to say about this. I think, you know, let's say, you know, to even try to address this, you know, well, what's the assignment of what should the assignment of responsibility be to start with? You know, well, and who has jurisdiction of what, right? So let's say, yeah, I'm a policymaker, and I'd say, like, okay, here's a social policy area that I think, you know, needs some work. We need to figure out ways in which we can introduce soft methods of change, like behavioral change interventions. So then and then I say, okay, well, go forth, you practitioners and researchers, and trial a whole load of interventions, see which works to change behavior for the good. And now let's say the findings come back and they show that actually none of the interventions worked, or they actually generated kind of epic failures. So who has responsibility for what and where? Right. So you think, well, is the problem of the failure because, you know, people weren't particularly receptive to the intervention, or they weren't even inclined to actually change their behavior, quite happy going about doing whatever it was that, you know, might be actually, you know, negatively impactful on them in the long run. See, okay, well, do we have to think about, you know, the levels of assignment of responsibility and blame to the target audience? I think, well, let's say, how can we tell that the researchers did due diligence to ensure that, you know, when they went into, especially in field settings, that they had fully reviewed the work that exists beforehand to know that the interventions they were trialing had any chance of working? So, well, in which case, yeah, you need, how can you actually ascertain that due diligence was done? And then you think, well, what assignment do you have to place in terms of responsibility to the policymaker? Well, yeah, maybe they had good intentions there. So all they would do is commissioning a whole load of work to try to generate behavioural change. So, I mean, I'm kind of laying out the field here. So so the kind of the question then comes back to you, which is, well, because you're the expert here in the room on responsibility and blame, and
That's not here, so I am in this room.
Well, okay, I'll do with you for the moment. So yeah, what more precisely, given that kind of characterization, do you want to kind of, because I'm happy to talk about this. This is an area that really needs kind of a lot more work, but it's kind of tidying up the precision of what kinds of responsibility and for what audiences do we need to start thinking about?
Yeah, no, it's a great question.
Thanks.
So actually, from reading some of your work, which I think was a step in that direction, actually, getting a better framework. I mean, in a way, I feel, again, it's a personal view, that in order to think about questions of responsibility, we need to get much better causal understanding of the system, what people's views are on the system, how people interact with the system. So it's a quite a complex causal web that we need to kind of try and unpick and at least have some sense of before we can then think about doing something responsibly, and also before we can then think of who to attribute responsibility to when it goes right or when it goes wrong. So I actually, in a way, the question was slightly inspired by reading your TICS article, whereby you were kind of suggesting a causal framework. And I know this fits with other people's work, people like Nancy Cartwright and others who've talked about policy in that domain. So in a way, I feel that, we need to do some better causal thinking, causal analysis of both the situation, the possibilities, what was foreseeable for people and what should have been reasonably foreseeable for the policymakers or the nudgers or whatever. And I don't know whether any of that work's been done yet, but I was feeling that actually the paper that I read of yours felt like it was, like setting up a framework. So maybe you could, throwing it back to you, Magda.
Thanks, Dave. Let's say there's two levels here. One is, of course, both of us have sympathies on this, which is that and Cartwright, from my reading of this, which is, the idea, there's many ways which you can kind of make things a little better and a little easier. And sometimes we do these kind of things almost incidentally, which is, okay, well, you kind of tell a causal story of, I'm going to do this, this is going to happen. But maybe at the same time, what you should also be thinking about is, well, what are the things that might derail that? So, well, there may be a nominal thinking around that, but the idea is that, at least in the paper and many other things that not just me, others have written about, which is that you kind of try to even draw these things out. There's value to even drawing out, the map, as you say, or the web of different factors that kind of could interact with each other outside of what you expect to be the direct causal kind of mechanism that's leading to change. So that's one. See, it's actually quite easy to do. Well, it is and it isn't. I mean, in theory, it's easy enough to draw stuff. It's just thinking through the possibilities, which are actually incredibly hard, and how they actually interact with each other. But again, in the long run, if you do that before you go into the field and try these things out, at least you're better armed and you can actually make better sense of why something may have worked and also why it didn't necessarily work. So that's, the level of responsibility in terms of trying to attribute the factors that might have led to successes and failures. Sure, that's the kind of thing you should be doing. I think there's a separate issue in terms of, and again, I might throw this back to you, is, let's say you do all of that, you still find that the things failed, the interventions failed. Then what responsibility do you want to place on the researchers that trialed the interventions, or the other kind of actors in the system that were invested in trying to change behavior? right? So you think, well, then it becomes a kind of, well, especially in the kind of policy domain, you think, well, let's say an interesting question that kind of comes from that is, well, what counts as good evidence? Like, because a failure can still be good evidence, but but what responsibility do we place on that, or what premium do we place on that? So and again, I think you've done more work on this than anyone that I know. So I'd be kind of curious to hear what at that kind of much bigger level, how would we even go about doing a kind of systematic approach that we could take to kind of figure out the assignment of responsibility in, let's say, evidence that shows failures of interventions?
Yeah, I mean, if I had another program, but no, I think that actually there is, there are emerging kind of frameworks and ways of thinking about this, ways of thinking about causal mechanisms, evidence, how to integrate these things, which are, are being developed. So I feel that these frameworks are kind of like, would be really key to adopt to make this kind of study more rigorous, more scientific, to coordinate theory and evidence in the right way so that we can make kind of design responsible interventions and take responsibility for them. So, I mean, but we can maybe have another session on this, but we've actually run out of time, which is a great shame, but it's been an absolute pleasure chatting to you, Magda. I hope you've enjoyed it.
Indeed, the same.
A great pleasure, and thanks for everyone for listening. All 5 people and my cat who have been listening. Actually, she normally yawns through everything, but I think she's been listening today. Okay, great. Really nice to see everyone. Really lovely to see you, Magda, and till the next time.